So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Tiombe.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Feels like home. Usually I'm at the back table greeting you all for CEUs, but I'm really happy to be with you this morning to share with you what my experience has been, as Kim said, over almost the last 20 years, working pretty exclusively with survivors of all forms of sexual violence and intimate partner violence. And what I'm bringing to you today is really something that I hope will honor both the fact that April is Child Abuse Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. And so kind of bridging those two and thinking about the ways that specifically child sexual abuse and experiences of that leaves a legacy. And some of the time when we think about that, we come at it from a place of sort of single treatment models types of theories. And from my experience as someone who practices from a feminist therapy and trauma-informed as well as anti-oppression stance in my work, there are some other nuances that I think in the things that I've grown to learn and from the folks that have greatly mentored and guided me in my process as a therapist and helper, to look at some of those other issues that are weaved through the process of healing. So I'm going to touch on many of those today. You'll get snippets of, in the next couple hours together, of some of the work that I've done, and definitely invite you all to ask questions or comments even during. Stop if there's something that we can have a conversation about. We are going to have let me give you a few definitions. I'm going to talk about this from the vantage point of sexual violence, which is an entire spectrum of violations. So whether that was, molestation, incest, someone experiencing unwanted touching, someone being, raped, sexually assaulted as a teen, the types of sexual violence that occur in dating and intimate partner violence, all of those pieces, including that atmosphere of what a lot of folks call sexual terrorism, that oftentimes for vulnerable populations, and we know kids and teens being many of those, and I'll talk about what potentially other vulnerable populations might be, we know that the rates of some form of sexual assault or abuse happening in their life is much higher. So I look at that as that entire spectrum and the knowledge that we have as a society that it's very prevalent. I'm going to talk about multiple social identities because that's the context in which folks experience sexual abuse, and in that same context looking at how different identities can be privileged or targeted, and speak to this from the perspective again of a trauma-informed lens. Trauma, whether we want to call it PTSD or rape trauma syndrome, recognizing that that is part of the mix and part of the experience. So I gave you a little bit of kind of my philosophy of work. You'll see that woven through, and I really believe a lot of times we present things, whether that's as a treatment model or something like that, as something that's bias and value free, and we all do our work in the context of a certain value system, right? So if we're using cognitive behavioral models, we're usually going to prioritize cognition or things like that. Well, what we know is that when we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about abuse, that frontal lobe is very impacted, and some of the resources that the brain is giving is very limited to that part of the brain. So if we go about working with folks from purely a cognitive or cognitive behavioral lens, we're really missing a lot of the pieces that are going on for someone who's experiencing trauma. And really to introduce, in terms of the topic, what I'd like to say is I'm going to use very specific examples, and actually in just a moment I'm going to ask one of my wonderful colleagues, Jean, to come up and help us all with just a brief role play and demonstration, so that we can start from a place of thinking about a particular survivor's story, and we'll see some of the legacy and impact across a lifespan. So I do always like to give a trigger warning and acknowledge that anytime, whether you're doing this in a professional or a personal capacity, whether that's at a social gathering, when we talk about issues of abuse, child sexual abuse and things like that, there are survivors in the room, and I think it's important to always know that our community is strengthened by the knowledge that survivors have over whether or not we believe that this is an important issue. And I think that's a really important place to start, with respect for that the information that we have, and definitely the work that I do, is fueled by and inspired by those voices, right? This began first as a survivor-centered movement, so I really want to give honor to that. And then definitely say, take care of yourself. As we talk about some of these details today, it can be triggering, so please feel free to just take care of yourself, step out, take a break, and definitely take care, because I know for me, April can be a really intense month with everything that goes on. So we're going to talk about the story of Laura, made up name, but an interactive story that actually asks for your participation. And we know that whenever someone is experiencing abuse and trauma, there are folks that are surrounding that person in a lot of ways. And so what this story asks you to do is to think about the layers, think about the multiple ways that someone is experiencing potentially that abuse or trauma in their context of their own life. So Jean has been so kind, she's already come up and she's gonna be there in that seat, representing Laura in the story. And what I'm gonna ask all of you to do is I'm going to actually just take down our PowerPoint for just a moment and have us focus on this corner of the room. And as I read the story, I'm gonna ask that if you can just self-select. I'll stop each time there's a break in the story, and if you would come up, and you'll see that there's a chair with sheets on it. And if you'll come up and just unfold the sheet and place one sheet over Laura. So it's a silent exercise, and so everyone that feels comfortable can take part. If not, you'll take part by witnessing and watching and listening. So I'll read that story now. So just remember, if you'd like, please go ahead, just stand up. And if a couple people stand up, you can, decide, or whoever walks over first, go ahead and just put one sheet over Laura each time I take a break from the story, okay? Laura was born and raised in a very traditional and religious family. One of her earliest memories was hearing her father call her mother names. Sometimes, after an argument, she would see her mother crying. When Laura was 5 years old, her uncle started to molest her at family gatherings. He told her that if she told anyone, she would be in big trouble for breaking up the family, and she would be taken away to live somewhere else. Besides, she knew that this was her mother's favorite brother, and that her dad worked for him. She told no one. When Laura went to Sunday school as a child, she was taught that children, and sometimes women, must obey. They stressed that girls must be prepared to be emotional caretakers for their families. Laura worked very hard in school. It was a place where she felt safe. She excelled. When Laura was in her second year of high school, she met the love of her life, Ben. A year later, after a pregnancy scare, They were arguing. Laura didn't feel like being sexual, but Ben pressured her until she gave in. This wasn't the first time. She laid there crying. After thinking about it for some time, Laura thought about going to a faith leader, but she was afraid that she would not be believed and that she would be blamed for being a teen having sex, and that she didn't think anyone would believe her about the rapes. Laura finally decided she would go to her mother and tell her what was happening. Although she was nervous that her mother had been struggling with relapsing lately, she told her anyway. Her mother said, "This is how men are. If you are ever going to want to get married, you better get tougher. It can't be that bad." Many times, Laura would experience pressure, demands for sex, and be called names. In the end, it would often follow up with a rape from Ben. She told no one again. Laura, why do you stay? Why do you put up with this stuff? Why haven't you told anyone what's going on and gotten help? Why are you so weak? Just be stronger. Now each time I read a piece of this story, will folks come up and take a sheet off? And you don't have to fold it, you can just drop it on the floor next to the chair, okay? Laura went to a health center for her annual exam, and the doctor noticed that there were some bruises on her thighs. On the way out of the office that day, he turned to Laura and said, "You know, there are crisis centers where you can go." She continued to walk out. Laura decided she had some time after her part-time work and that she might start taking college classes. She decided to take a women's studies class. Ben and his friends made lots of fun of her. One afternoon, she stopped by the women's center where she found a brochure about sexual abuse. It said at the top, "You are not alone." One day in her psychology class, one of her classmates gave a presentation that gave the definitions of sexual violence and domestic violence. Laura saw a newspaper report and read about how a young woman had been killed by her abusive boyfriend. Laura found a book about women of faith who were abused, and she started to read it. She found some religious text, and she read, "You are God's temple," and she started to believe it. She eventually decided to tell a friend at school about being sexually abused as a child. Her friend was very supportive, and she gave her a hotline number that she could call. After threatening and calling names and forcing Laura again, Ben left to hang out with his friends. That night, Laura called an advocate on a hotline and asked for help. Laura, you have rights and choices. You are not to blame, and you are not alone. Thank you. So, let's debrief for just a moment. What are folks' reactions to seeing Laura's story? Please.
Great way to demonstrate layers.
Right, yeah. There are a lot of different things going on, right? Even things that may seem kind of just commonplace, but added a layer potentially, or many, yes. Thank you. Other thoughts or things that you saw? Please, Tensia.
I saw how each person can contribute to healing.
Yes, absolutely, right? So we saw layers going on, but we also saw things that contributed to that healing process, right? Little by little. Yeah. What were some, yes, please.
Even though they were just sheets, I could still feel the weight, and I could still feel the suffocation of all the trauma of the life of Laura.
Yes, absolutely. So we're trying to represent something here about some of the feelings that would go with that. So thank you for saying that sense of the weight, the suffocation, right? Just carrying something that was really heavy, definitely.
And when it was time to help Laura, there was a feeling of where do you even begin?
Yeah, absolutely. So she said having a feeling of where do you even begin? What were some of the things that we heard that added layers, that created some of the coverings and pieces that caused the trauma, the distress? Yes.
From early on, her realization that it could ruin the father's job if she spoke up.
Yes, absolutely, right? So some of the things that, even though someone's a little child, that sense of responsibility, right? And we know developmentally that that's exactly where they're supposed to be. The world revolves around them. And so they also feel like, well, I'm key to what's happening, right, around me. If I do this thing, if I talk about this, it could hurt everyone, right? And then it would be my fault, right? That being central in their own lives because of where they are developmentally, that brings about a lot of self-blame and responsibility. Yes, yes, absolutely. Other things, please.
The feeling that nobody would believe you, even if you spoke up and said anything about it.
Yes, absolutely, right? So that sense that maybe there's not a safe space to talk about this, and are people going to really believe what's going on? And we know that unfortunately that's a realistic thing, that oftentimes people experience multiple very difficult or even re-traumatizing disclosures before they find one good one. Yes, please.
I think also the observation of her parents' relationship. So for her, that normalized what then happened later on. So it just seems like that's just the way that people interact.
Absolutely, right? And even before mom sort of overtly gives that message, there's already, right, that piece that she's seen, that sort of dynamic in a relationship. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, some of those connections. Yes. What happened visually for you all as you watched Laura? Was there a transformation? Was there a way that you were thinking about or seeing this person after it started to happen?
She just was slowly but surely
Disappearing, yes. We were losing sight, right, of the whole person. Absolutely. And that's something that I really believe is central to our work in being a part. I know all of us, are here because we want to be a part in some way, shape, or form with healing individuals, families, communities, that we can't lose sight of that individual, right? And who they are and what makes up their life and their values and their sense of self. But oftentimes the trauma and maybe the coping skills that person's using and what other resources they need, all of that starts to give us sort of a filter where we can't see as clearly what's going on for that individual. Yes. We talked about that heaviness, the sense of losing sight, definitely, yeah. How did folks feel about what I said to her once she's all covered up with all of that?
Well, I thought that was pretty powerful to watch her covered by all the sheets and to have that response, because you hear that so often from friends and family. It's like, you know, why don't you be stronger? Why don't you do something about this? And visibly seeing her covered and unable to move,
Right.
where you kind of realize how hard it is to make that first step without some of those layers being removed.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that feeling of, I mean, we've all heard those things said, right? I mean, I would say those are the standard comments that people make. I know if I even tell someone what I do on an airplane, those are, well, tell me, well, then you must know. Why do people stay? Or why won't, if something's happening so bad, I would tell someone, right? We know that those are the beliefs that oftentimes folks hold about sexual assault, about domestic violence, even about child abuse, right? What's the first thing someone says to that 16-year-old who comes and says, I was molested when I was 4? Well, why are you telling me now, right? How come I've been here for you all this time? And possibly with good intentions, with a feeling of, oh, I should have been there, but that's the time to be able to say, I'm here, what do you need, right? Very different response. And so I hope we can keep in mind, right, and as we're sharing our skills with other folks, just how hard it would be at that point if we thought of those, just these 8 little sheets that were the layers of Laura's story. Did we really think that she could just get up and throw those all off and now I'm done, right? It's all over. And I'm going to just change everything that those layers represent. And I think that's where we have to understand and really respect the process, the legacy, what I kind of term as the legacy of how child sexual abuse has all of those multiple layers. Yeah. What did we see that took layers off? Or did it, and if folks had other comments about that piece? Sally,
Oh, I just, it was amazing to me because I've read, I've worked with people, and I was surprised that a person expected someone to come out from underneath all of this stuff, and why don't you talk about it? Well, duh. Now it's like now I get it.
Yeah, absolutely, right? That sense of like, oh, that is going to be so
Hard.
absolutely difficult, so hard. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I think it was just a great exercise to actually visually see, because as somebody that works with people every single day, and you know, and we know, and we're trained and so forth, but it took Laura that first step to actually make that choice to do something different, and the first layer comes off. But not only that, she still has multiple layers that she has to work through, and you know, keep that determination to stay on course and keep making, you know, hard decisions, and even having all these other issues.
Right.
I think it was just amazing to see it, you know, here and see how everybody reacts to it. I think it was very great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that feedback. And you know, if we thought about this realistically, probably while some layers were going on, or being taken off, there were probably still some going on, correct, right? So she's still in situations where she may not get the support she needs, or where there's the ongoing abuse, right, now in the teen and going into early adulthood relationship, right? Oftentimes we think of this in terms of like, okay, well, what's happening for someone? Can I see physical bruises? Are those sorts of things, you know, predominant? And what I've seen a lot of times is where a partner will make the sexual violence very predominant. And that's sometimes the types of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and especially teen dating violence that we don't call attention to. And it can be something that is under the radar for a very long time, because people are asking, well, you know, does your boyfriend push you? Does your girlfriend text you 26 times a day? We have some of those questions. I think we're much better at them. But we can still, as helpers, as first responders, feel a little bit uncomfortable about asking about things like, do you get pressured, to do sexual things that aren't really things that you like? Or what's the comfort around the two of you talking about how you consent or how you decide whose body gets touched and how that happens, right? Tell me a little bit about your last interaction with that person in an intimacy context. that those are often difficult conversations to have, right? Are we having them with our partners? So think about even very happily consensual connection to a partner, and that can be a hard conversation. And then think about how someone is supposed to kind of blow off all those layers and tell us about, right, repeated sexually coercive and abusive situations throughout their lifespan, how difficult that process is, right? Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to note is the things that took the layers off, right? The very first person said, hey, there are these places you can get help. There are these crisis centers. And often we think about that as like, there's the answer, right? But it took lots of other things happening before that phone call, before there was even a sense of like, maybe I can mobilize some of those resources. So recognizing that we plant those seeds, but knowing that there's no quick fix, right? There's not any one thing we can do that creates closure with intensity and speediness. Yes?
I found comfort in thinking, I don't remember what triggered it, I'm sorry, but that a lot of times I'll take the domestic violence handouts and put them at the schools when I work there, or take them to the doctor's office where there's no magazines or anything to read. And I thought, I know I'm doing good, but this kind of validated that people do pick things up and read them. So thank you.
Absolutely, right? We know that just planting that seed. I have had someone come into my office and say, pull from the bottom of their purse an old brochure, or I had this card for 6 years, or I read this article. And we don't know, again, that's, I always believe that it's so important if we want to be, a community that heals individuals, families, communities, that we have to put that message out there and think about the fact that we are only as safe as what the last survivor heard in that chat over dinner, in that water cooler conversation, right, at their doctor's office. And if what they hear is shame and blame and why didn't they leave and how come someone didn't tell, and that kid is a troublemaker anyway, you can't really listen to teens, they lie all the time. If those are the things people hear, it's not gonna be a safe space. So thinking about what those other layers are going to be important. So I know we're familiar, but I wanted to just go through some of the things that are parts of child sexual abuse, not an exhaustive list, but thinking about how some of the things that are outside the box of what we think about in terms of sexual assault, molestation, rape, things where folks, technology and especially being able to take all sorts of pictures, it's, I think, a really huge spike in coerced and forced sexting, even for folks, in elementary and middle school age, being asked to pose for those sorts of things, obviously being forced or coerced into any form of, oral or other genital contact, being penetrated, being fondled or kissed or held in ways that are unwanted. And I think a lot of times we have policies in families that say to kids, well, go kiss Aunt so-and-so, Uncle so-and-so wants you to sit on their lap, or you didn't give grandfather a hug, or you're being rude or disrespectful. And I think teaching that kids have the right to have boundaries around their bodies is so important. It also allows us to start to see, and we'll talk about this a bit, if a child is starting to react or have sexually reactive behaviors in some way, when that sort of starts to go from that spectrum of these are just normal curiosities to, where are they getting this from, over to, wow, this is really a red flag. That's a behavior or sexual knowledge that child shouldn't have at that age. So when we think about how kids may be, involved and have a lot of exposure, especially now because, porn culture is so pervasive, that there's exposure to inappropriate sexual knowledge. And we want to determine, right, is that something where I can monitor better their use of technology, or is this something that's being introduced as a part of grooming by someone who would perpetrate abuse? And those are all things we want to pay attention to. Made or to watch pornography or be around or be in the bed while adults are, exposing themselves or performing sexual acts, being bathed inappropriately or intrusively, being objectified and ridiculed for one's body. And I think you see this a lot in terms of kids going through puberty and being poked fun of, or having their body be a source of a lot of attention, even within the family, that can feel very much like, is this the only thing I'm good for? What does that mean? Or having natural curiosity, things like masturbation, or wanting to know, why does my body look different than my sister's, or things like that, being shut down as bad or horrible and not being able to be talked about. So then if I'm not even able to ask the question why our bodies look different, if something's happening to my body, or I see something happen to my sister on that part of her body, I'm not going to say anything, right? That's bad. I'm not supposed to talk about those parts. So we shut down a lot of the opportunities we might have for safety and those discussions. Obviously, commercially sexually exploited children, child trafficking, these are things that are now, I think rightfully so, getting attention. But one of the things that I've seen is, my earliest phone calls with a sexual assault hotline were talking to folks who had been trafficked by their own parents, right? Who had a parent who traded them with other perpetrators of child sexual abuse. So these sorts of stories, we have to be very prepared to hear the worst of the worst, and to be able to be a compassionate witness to things that we probably don't want to hear or know, that may be very difficult, that may even touch a chord in terms of your own experience, but be willing to be that witness, to hold space for things that other people don't want to hear. Because so often survivors are finding huge stop signs, right? They've already potentially had, as Laura did, that parent that says, can't be that bad, or who is ready to interrogate and needs all the details in order to believe it's bad enough to really warrant anything being done, or the one who just checks out and denies that it ever happened. And we know that while that parent may be considered the non-offending parent, the impact of that additional trauma is potentially what set that child up, for more vulnerability in the first place, but definitely in the long run potentially runs the risk of adding more trauma to that experience. So just to give us a little bit in terms of stats and prevalence, what we see in terms of lifetime rates for sexual violence is about 1 in 3 girls. Dr. Ross, who is a feminist researcher, did the research, and she did interviews, one-on-one interviews with folks. She found in her research about 2 out of 3 women. And that was because they weren't having to check off a box that said, have you ever been, sexually assaulted, raped? She talked about, have you had experiences where you weren't feeling up to or didn't want to experience certain sexual contact, but had a partner that either forced or coerced or talked you into it, or started while you were sleeping, or did it when you were on medication, or too soon after you were recovering from a pregnancy and birth. And when she asked those sorts of questions and got into those discussions, what she heard was a lot more instances of forced or coerced sexual contact. 1 in 5 to 1 in 7 boys, and that range comes because we definitely know that often male survivors are more hesitant to come forward because of all the things that get connected to that around gender identity and sexual orientation. And when we're in a very sexist and homophobic atmosphere, that's going to shut down, right? A lot of times people will say to me, well, do you only work with women? Is that? And I say, no, absolutely not, because a lot of what we know is being a survivor of child sexual abuse or of sexual violence crosses all races, all genders, all classes, all of that. And it's important that there are safe spaces for every survivor, no matter their identity. We know that trans people are at an extremely high risk, about 1 in 2 in their lifetime. A lot of times we have stereotypes about, how gender plays into that, or that, again, I've finished a whole presentation and people will say, like, well, why did you only talk about women? And I'll say, well, please correct me. I try to be very gender neutral. I use the term survivor, and they're like, well, survivor means women. Not that I know of, but I think people come into, right, these sorts of discussions with some stereotypes about who we're talking about. And so I think it's important for us to always remember to be inclusive, right, across all forms of gender and gender expression. We definitely know in households and in terms of overlapping types of abuse, males in households where there's domestic violence and sexual violence going on are about 12 times more likely to be physically assaulted as well, and that 98% of the time perpetrators are male, regardless of the victim's gender identity. They often identify as heterosexual, and what we know is that silence, as I said, is very much connected to how someone believes they'll be perceived. Right. So again, it's the combination of those things, making sure that there's safety to come forward and that there aren't those ongoing stereotypes. We also know that in terms of sexual violence and oppression, that these crimes don't happen in a vacuum. Right. So they don't happen sort of as this single event that can be plucked out and then dealt with as that's the only thing going on. They're in the context of someone's own, ethnic, racial, class, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, religion or faith background, their body size, immigration status, first language. All of these pieces are part of what would be in the mix, right? So in Laura's story, we talked about, right, a dad working for the brother, right? What if that was, dad who is undocumented and that's potentially the only employer where he's going to be able to make an income, right? That's going to add another layer. If that job is lost because I come forward and I tell about it, how many other folks, or how is that going to impact our family, right? And the fear potentially of prejudice or discrimination around that identity adds another layer. So victimization and oppression are very, very similar, right? So sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, and forms of oppression, racism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, all of those things absolutely depend on myth. For people to believe things that are either just misunderstandings all the way to blatant ways to discount and discredit the experiences of whole groups of people, right? So mythology about that. And it's about power over. We're a society that, how many of us have ever worked in a non-hierarchical workplace? Do we even know what that would mean? Does anyone here have a flat org chart? Now I do at Bridges to Healing because we set it up that way. And it took us 5 years to create a structure where we are truly a collective and we're consensus driven. But I think that is a very rare situation. And what we encounter are people saying, well, who's the director? I need to talk to the person in charge. Well, we all are. You're talking to them, but that is it's an odd concept. So even in very benign ways, we don't understand a concept of shared power. That is not what we're used to at all. So power and control over other people becomes sort of commonplace, and we disregard the ways that can have a negative impact on how we view the world and how we see ourselves. Both can have a traumatic impact. So what we know is that even microaggressions, someone saying, as people say, the off-color joke, or using the term gay to mean stupid, someone making a racial slur, and you overhear that, we know that the brain actually responds to those things, what we call microaggressions, as you would to a trauma. It sends off an alert in the brain that says, I might not be safe here, right? Is this a place where I can be myself, bring my full self? So those are things we want to think about. Is our waiting room a place that actually shows that we have art or magazines or care about all communities that might walk through our doors? Or does our website or our brochure really kind of show who we're inviting to come and partake in those services? So all of those things are going to be having an impact in terms of how we can give folks a message. And if we think about these things, how trauma and oppression impact our worldview, our identity, think about that in terms of child development, right? We're just learning what our view of the world is. Is the world a fair place? Is the world a place where my voice is heard? Is the world a place where adults or other people are going to care for and attend to my emotional and physical needs? Or is it a place where I'm going to mostly be left on my own to fend for myself, and if something bad happens, there's not a lot of recourse in terms of what I can do with that information, right? That sense of the worth of the individual. Am I capable? Am I worthy of love? These are questions that in throughout those developmental phases, children are really answering. And we know that especially, child abuse and child sexual abuse are going to give a very specific message, a set of messages. And we're going to look at how those continue throughout that child's development. So if we think about kind of starting at the beginning of this, one of the things to recognize is that 80% of survivors of child sexual abuse know the perpetrator of that sexual violence. And we'll talk in a moment about how that's actually higher for certain populations. So 80% is already the vast majority. And what we know is that means there is often some sort of relationship. And I don't mean in terms of like a dating or a sexual relationship, but some sort of engagement and interaction. It's usually someone that child knows, likes, or loves. And I hope we can replace this even when we're talking about teens, because we use a lot of terminology like date rape or acquaintance rape. What does that do when we put date or acquaintance in front of the word rape? Say
That you don't know them?
Okay, so then if rape would be you don't know the person, but date or acquaintance, what sort of impact does that have?
It
minimizes. It sort of makes it seem less serious.
Yes. Minimizes it, it's less serious. Well, you were out with the person, right? You knew them somehow. And so, we don't talk about if, we went to a, movie together with someone and they took our wallet out of our bag. We don't say, I was just date robbed. Right? Why not? But we're just telling when it happened, but somehow that's exactly what we do when it comes to sexual violence. And I think that's a very clear message to teens, especially who are at very high risk for sexual violence within dating relationships where there's any form of abuse. We are going to hear a very different, oops, did that go off? I think the battery went out on this. Can folks still hear me? Okay, and please raise a hand. I definitely don't want anyone to struggle, but it's if you push it. But what teens often are responding to is the fact that that terminology is used a lot. Well, teen years are the years when they should be curious about potentially dating, starting to, figure out what that looks like. Do I want a relationship? What sort of relationship? I'm having feelings for people. So if we start labeling, right, any traumatic experiences they may have in ways that means that didn't really count. You shouldn't be so upset about it. You were the one who went out with that person. Then we're already shutting down that discussion. We know that, and guess what? Perpetrators know that. So they are much more interested in that process in developing some level of relationship with the person, or counting on the one they already have, family member, counting on the one they already have, coach, mentor, someone who is already a family friend. Those things build already a sense of trust. And that relationship may be cultivated very overtly to create opportunity, but it also may just be ready-made, already there, already a part of the fabric of that community or that family or whatever that place where the abuse may occur. So I know this slide is pretty small. You do have it in your handout, but I want us to think about this from this point of view of an ecological view of trauma. So we're really looking at the fact that there is a context, right, if you will, like an ecosystem around all of us. And when trauma and abuse occur, that ecosystem, that ecological view is important. We know that all of these factors, so we were looking at Laura's story and thinking, what were all of those layers? And so these are some of the layers, right? Individual factors like the age of the person when it happens, the developmental level. Those things are going to make a big difference in how that sexual abuse impacts that child. Did that happen when that child was, pre-verbal? And then we'll have to try to figure out how to process that without verbal memories. Is that something that happened as that child was becoming verbal and language development then regressed? And then they got a lot of sort of pressure and services and all sorts of things around what's happening. Why aren't they, gaining language the way they're supposed to? Awesome, thank you. Is that better? Okay. Excellent. So also previous traumatization, right? Previous trauma. What sorts of coping skills, right? It may be different, and we can see this where if you see a child maybe who is 9 versus a child who's 13, what they know about themselves and how they cope with stress is going to be different just because of that developmental level. What else may make it different is if they've coped with other things before and who helped them know how to cope with those things. Have they had adults in their life that have made them feel capable or as though they could come to them if something was going on, if they were struggling? And if they're continuing to have struggles and they still aren't feeling empowered, what does that mean for sort of their ongoing well-being? We also know that some of those other layers are the event factors. So things like how frequently this is happening, right? The severity, how much injury is involved. And especially with child sexual abuse, humiliation and terror, right? So having to continue to be around that person, see your parents really like or respect that person, or tell you that you need to be around them or love them. And even if that's not something the child has ever told, but especially maybe if they have, and they're still being told they have to, like that or respect that person, it couldn't have happened. Imagine, right, the level of humiliation, terror, the presence of what we call bystanders, right? Bystanders being present, meaning folks who could have or had some capacity to intervene but didn't, or couldn't, right? Didn't feel they had the tools. And we're not saying that makes someone terrible, but what we're saying for the survivor is that can turn up the volume on the traumatic impact. That sense that there were some other folks that I thought or should have been able to count on, and they weren't able, capable, willing, whatever that may be, to intervene in some way, right? Definitely environmental factors. Where is this happening? Is it happening, at school in, the back of the PE changing room in a place where I'm supposed to be happy and I've happily participated in, sports since first grade, and now something horrible is happening in a space where I really loved to be, right? That factor is going to impact that child as well. Things like whether it's happening in, a ready-made social support system. So if Laura and Ben are buddies with everybody else at high school, right? What happens to that circle of friendship for that teen? They're not only going to lose, potentially, right, that boyfriend that she loves, but also, who else? The friends, right? There's going to be a very quick, probably, decision of a divide and conquer. And in an individuation stage for teens, who are they more likely to side with? The person with the power, right? Or they'll do the, I'm neutral on it, right? We see adults doing this too, but definitely I think it's more developmentally kind of, I want to be neutral, I don't want to play the blame game with anyone. Neutrality is always on the side of the powerful, right? There is no neutrality in terms of taking on, issues of sexual abuse. Neutrality gives more power to the perpetrator. And I think that's something that we have to recognize in terms of how responses can say to someone, I really believe you, I absolutely want to support you, or can say, really what happened, maybe was it that bad, or I just want, I don't want to get involved, right? Those sorts of responses, or I feel for you, but I'm going to still maintain a really strong relationship with that perpetrator, even though it's clear what they've done to you, right? Those are things that we know can have major impacts. And this isn't a place to say, so we have to think that those people are horrible or evil. But we need to know when we're that person who's a first responder to the survivor, that those responses from their ecosystem, from their support system, are additional layers of trauma, right? And those are some of the things we don't often unpack with folks because we're more thinking about the event, about the abuse, and not necessarily about the other realms, right? The oppression and the other legacy. Definitely re-traumatization, so those contributing factors being what happened on your past disclosures, right? We feel good, right? I always notice in the Laura exercise, and this is something I adapted. I first saw something similar to this with Faith Trust Institute, which is an ecumenical and interfaith institute for training both anti-sexual, domestic, and child abuse advocates, along with clergy and faith leaders of multiple faiths and communities. And I saw something like this around kind of the ways that religion could add layers or take away layers in terms of the life of a survivor of trauma. And so I've adapted it to multiple communities and things like that. So please let me know if folks are interested in using it. Yeah. I say, hey, do it. But what they've spoken to is really looking at the fact that people go often to family, to faith communities as a first disclosure. And we may feel very excited, right? Like, oh good, they're telling someone. People walk faster to take sheets off than to put them on. Did you notice that? Right? It probably felt better to you. Some of you may have thought, I'm not getting up there and putting a sheet on top of that person. That feels terrible, right? But it may have felt okay to come and take a sheet off, or even empowering, or like we're part of the solution. And one of the things that we know, is that it's much harder to recognize that there have been probably other disclosures previous to our excitement about now, oh, they're doing this, they're calling this hotline, they're talking to me, this is going to be a good thing. What we have to sometimes process is that relationship, that good experience of disclosure with us is probably being impacted by the ones that came before that were not so great. And that's going to be in the room with us as we are trying to support that survivor in the moment. That those past experiences of, the judging question, or not understanding, or trying to really curtail, well, you've got to stop this coping mechanism right now, it's unhealthy, right? Those sorts of things are still kind of in the room, even if we're someone who's very open and supportive to their process. So all of these pieces, including those re-traumatizing experiences, are part of those additional layers. So just to start to put together then a bit about how specific oppression, I want to use an example. We looked at Laura's story, but I want to think about how survivors, and especially kids that live with any form of disability, that could be neuromuscular, learning, a communicative disability, that could be any form, a mobility, that could be a child with autism. Any of those pieces may add vulnerability. Why? Because perpetrators and abusers look for vulnerability. About 96% of survivors with disabilities know the perpetrator, and folks with disabilities are at about 2 to 10 times the rate of sexual violence. When just recently speaking at an Office of Violence Against Women conference, and speaking to President Obama's leader on looking at the rights of folks with disabilities, he was saying that they're really seeing that we can drop off the 2 to 6 times research, that the most recent research is really saying 8 to 10 times as likely. So lifetime rates that are 8 to 10 times as high. And what that's from are multiple perpetrators, right? Multiple perpetrators across the lifespan. And again, we really have to think about this as high risk, not cause. Because part of the oppression is thinking of it as, oh gosh, well then there's something we have to infantilize or make sure that we're protecting. It's much more about, I think, the prevention efforts that focus on how can we intervene as bystanders, and how can we make sure that vulnerability in those ways is not exploited. Oftentimes the access is through caregiving, so some type of either employment or being an intimate partner, right? Whether that's of the parent of the child with a disability or specifically dating or becoming the intimate partner of the person themselves. And we do see folks doing that, even just wanting to date someone with children in order to perpetrate child sexual abuse, or wanting to, become, connected to a family that has kids, or become a babysitter in order to have access to that child. And when we think about that idea of the very high rate of relationships, so connection, someone that person with a disability knows, likes, or loves, what we see then is invisibility of communities of folks with disabilities. I mean, when's the last time you saw someone in a commercial or a major TV show that identified as a person living with a disability? That was a main character, or that was where the disability wasn't the focus of the movie or the story, right? Mm-hmm. So what we know is that absolute invisibility creates such a level of oppression. What a lot of folks, and this is an area that I specialize in, is working with folks who are child sexual abuse survivors who have different forms of disability. And I work with a client who doesn't voice for herself and uses a communicative device. And one of the things that, she often struggles with is the sense of feeling as though, even if I was ready at multiple points, and her child sexual abuse went from 6 to 16 with a sister's husband or her brother-in-law. And she told multiple members of the family who didn't believe it, right? Which put her at even higher risk and let that person know, keep on doing what you're doing because nobody's going to stop this. What do we think, right? What were the risks? What would put someone who has, and if we've thought sort of broadly about lots of different forms of disability, what might put that child with a disability at higher risk for sexual violence? Not that they cause it, but creates more risk.
That dependency.
Yes, okay.
Maybe the need to help with toileting or changing or potentially not being able to communicate.
Right, absolutely. So potentially the needs for assistance, yeah. Toileting, changing, having other folks who are there to provide assistance, right? So it makes that a normalized behavior that person is or providing some form of assistance. And if they change that into something that's abusive, that line may be very difficult to delineate or to tell someone about. What other sorts of things? What creates more risk, do we think? And you can just shout out ideas or thoughts that you have. Please.
More one-on-one time.
Yes.
Caregivers basically are alone. So
yes.
It's a very secret one-on-one relationship.
Yes.
And the caregiver has a lot better ability to communicate their intentions than the victim.
Yes, right? So a lot of one-on-one time and a lot of that isolation of that relationship, and often the caregiver being either an ability to communicate sort of what's going on, right, in that relationship, or being listened to more, right? Having their word about what's happening in that caregiving or what they're doing as an assistant being taken as more valuable or more credible than the person or that child with a disability. Yeah, do we see that those sorts of assumptions being made? Tori?
Well, I think the power is there also in terms
yes.
of who's going to take care of them if this person leaves, similar to Laura's story about the father being employed on the uncle.
Yeah.
There's that sort of thing to consider.
Yes, absolutely. If this person is my caregiver and I tell that they're abusing me and that makes the abuse or that person go away, where do I get that care from, right? Does that leave me without something that I need? Yes, so it's the potential for that very real loss, definitely. So I want to kind of think about, we've gotten a lot of these, but think about those high risk factors. And again, think about this as vulnerable, not culpable, right? The only person culpable or responsible to blame for the sexual abuse is the perpetrator, is the person who decided to do it. But what we know is that opportunity, access, and vulnerability are the things that oftentimes perpetrators will look for. And what we know is that oftentimes for kids, right, even just some of these, are just in terms of being a child, right? Being in a group of folks that has less power, less voice, all of that. You add to that disability and you have another level, right? Now you have ableism in addition, right? So not being believed, not being seen as a credible person, right? Think of that in terms of folks who have psychiatric disabilities, right? Have some sort of mental health diagnosis, especially if it's a diagnosis where sometimes they may experience being out of reality. People believing like, oh, well, they can't be an accurate historian of anything. Not true at all. Folks who even experience very, severe episodes of psychosis or severe episodes of being out of reality are absolutely capable of telling us if someone's hurting them or what that's like. Thinking about the ways that we infantilize or encourage, right? I've been to many a day treatment program for kids and teens and even adults with disabilities where there's a very real emphasis on, going over and being physically affectionate, being alone with caregivers, developing those relationships. And if people are safe, that's wonderful. But I think we also, again, have to recognize that not disallowing those boundaries and some of the oppression that we see around, for instance, a teen girl with, maybe on the autism spectrum dating someone who does not identify as having a disability, being seen as like, oh, that's a great thing, right? Because that's some sort of compliment, right? That it somehow is going to better you because you're dating someone who doesn't have a disability. Being taught about sex, sexuality, the body. I know when, for years in working at the Rape Crisis Center, we would have to, knock on a lot of doors to get into schools and do anti-sexual violence, anti-bullying education. And so often we'd finally get in, there'd be a school counselor or a teacher who was really a champion of what we were doing, and we'd get in and we'd say, okay, so we're gonna talk to every 6th grade class, or we're gonna talk to every 8th grade science, or we're gonna talk to every 10th grade health class, except which one? Special education. Every time. We even built a specific curriculum to talk about some of the vulnerabilities and how ableism played a role and how someone might target, right? Befriend and start to say like, hey, you get teased, you get bullied, I'm gonna be that confidant, right? We know that this is a pattern. Still couldn't get into those classrooms. They don't need to know. Their parents say they're not gonna date, right? And this happens just across the board. We know that prevention around sexual and domestic violence, doing healthy relationship work has to start prior to middle school, right? That create additional layers of trauma. So, yes, please.
I think overall there's this ableist this idea, this distortion that people with disabilities are not sexual, do not have a sexuality, do not, need to have that sex education, are never going to be dating, those types of ideas. And so they're not taught basic things that, sometimes younger children are taught, like good touch, bad touch.
Yes.
Let me know if anybody ever touches you inappropriately. Like, this is where your bathing suit covers and no one should be touching you there or doing anything inappropriate. And those things are not taught to people with disabilities because they're not seen as a full person who's going to have the capacity to even want to have sex in the future or any of those things, to start preparing them for how to be able to control their own bodies and protect themselves.
Absolutely. So and definitely that's, and I don't think I touched on it, but the one like no one would want them or see them as sexually attractive. I mean, that's a myth in terms of it being ableist, but also remember how oppression and violence depend on the same myths. So the myth that sexual assault is somehow about sexual attraction, right? Or about sex at all. And that then the ableist view that, well, someone with a disability doesn't have the same biological and hormonal and all of the other pieces around being developed as a sexual person. And I think that's a huge misunderstanding that creates a lot of lack of safety, right? Yeah, thank you. So important. So then, if we think about we're at time to take our break. Absolutely, that's a good place to stop. Why don't we take about a 5-minute break? So I wanted to talk a bit about grooming. And it probably makes sense, definitely in this presentation, as we talk about child abuse and specifically child sexual assault, to think about grooming. But what I would put out there is that grooming occurs in any type of power-based personal violence. So any situation where there's a power dynamic and there's interpersonal violence, grooming is happening, no matter the age or developmental level or where that person is in terms of their life experience. And I don't mean that to say, grooming happens and that means that an adult is being groomed and that means they're childlike. Not at all. I think what we know is that there's a opportunity and sometimes vulnerability created by cultivating that relationship, right? And so grooming is a part of that building trust, creating some sort of access to the person, and think about that from the point of view that that is what allows for the sexual abuse to occur, but also often ensures a bit of the silence afterwards. So if we were to think about this, grooming is often labeled in a couple different ways. Positive grooming, and I put that in quotes, or negative grooming. What might be some forms of each? What might be something that could be considered positive grooming? So not that it's good that someone's being groomed, but it may look on its face like it's positive. Please.
Like positive reinforcement, so complimenting.
Yes,
you're really
compliments.
giving them a lot of good feedback.
Yes, attention, right? It's positive to be attended to have compliments, to give someone good feedback, right? Especially if maybe that person's not necessarily getting that from somewhere else. Yeah, you're becoming a little bit of a confidant, becoming a supporter, someone who's encouraging. Definitely. What other sorts of things? Yes.
Well, I'm thinking, sort of goes along with the same thing, but as that spending time and doing fun things together, like if it's somebody who maybe their parents both work and they don't have a lot of time, like taking them to fun places or places that their parents, so even just trips to the library, trips to get ice cream, those kinds of things.
Yes, yeah, taking trips together, doing fun things, creating memories together. These are connections that later on, and what I would say is, I spend some time working with child sexual abuse survivors talking about the specific experiences and when or if they are ready to talk about details of what occurred, but a lot more talking about that context. What were the things, those memories, those special moments when that person was their encourager or took them on this trip that they remembered, and on that trip no sexual abuse occurred. It was the fifth time, right? And how that betrayal, how that turning point in that relationship and in that trust created such a schism, such damage. So those positive aspects potentially of grooming. What about negative aspects of grooming? What might that look like? Yes, hold
That
on.
would be like in Laura's story saying your father might lose his job or you would get sent away.
Yes, right? Threats, things that are letting that person feel partially to blame for it, right? So oftentimes what we call in grooming like sharing culpability. Hey, you wanted this too. You came over to my house to play, or, creating a scenario where that survivor feels part of the blame, right? What did I do that may have created this? Shaming or putting down that person, put downs about that person's body. All you're good for is sex, right? Or if you don't do this, you'll lose my love, right? So fear or threat of rejection or loss of love. These are negative grooming tactics that someone may use. So we know that those experiences are very instrumental to gaining the confidence or the trust or creating a further power imbalance with that child in order to create the abusive situation. And those aspects of grooming are ones that as a survivor moves into a healing process often are very pivotal in understanding how those are not at all indicators of their participation. Those are not at all indicators that they're somehow partially to blame or that they made this happen or that it's something about them. Those are tricks, those are manipulations. And I think it is so important for us to understand how manipulation and deception are the key tools of perpetrators of child sexual abuse, and that is going to be part of what's going on in many of those grooming scenarios. So other contributing factors. So when we think about grooming, we may think of those very specific things someone's doing, saying something, overt messages to the victim or survivor. But there are also contributing factors where nothing has to ever be said. The power differential is already in place, right? That difference in whose voice is going to be taken as more important, right? Who's going to be listened to in that community or that family? Who has a certain status? All of those elements are in the mix. We only have to look at any of the cases that make it into the media to acknowledge that we're much more likely to be incredulous if we have good feelings toward the person who is, accused of some form of sexual violence, that doesn't sit well with us. So power differentials are something that are a ready-made part of grooming, even in stranger assaults, right? So that if someone is in a position where they're caregiving, where they're a mentor, a coach, a teacher, a parent, right? A step-parent, someone who is in connection with that child or teen in such a way that there is a power differential. That can be there in terms of, siblings, in terms of age, body size, perceived, attractiveness, like the idea of, why would, as we hear with celebrities, well, that person could get any person they want. Why would they have to sexually assault people? And again, coming back to that mythology, it's not about sex, it's about conquest, power and control, all of those sorts of things. But things like, IQ, type of employment, status, on the playground, those sorts of pieces around power really then lend themselves later to perceptions of who's credible, right? When this information comes out, who's going to be believed and who's going to gain support. And that, again, in that ecosystem of trauma, what we know is that oftentimes that adds to re-traumatization, right? If that credibility, or if people believe in the survivor support system that they're not credible, that can add to that trauma experience. We also know that folks beyond or besides the survivor get groomed. Who else may be groomed in that process? The family, right? So not only is that person maybe connecting in a very positive way to their intended victim or victims, but to everyone who's potentially able to support that child. Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of that teacher in Wilmington that was caught. I feel that he groomed people in the community.
Yes, absolutely. So she's talking about a case with a teacher. And I was in a courtroom once doing a court advocacy training, and this was, I don't know if folks knew of it was a junior high teacher who was a swim coach and would take the swim team over to Catalina for their swim meets, and on those visits they would stay at a hotel, and he was sexually abusing multiple members of the swim team. So there was a 12-year-old boy who was on the swim team who was testifying all by himself, sitting up there on the stand, visibly very scared. And the courtroom was completely filled, with the exception of our row of sexual assault crisis advocates. The entire courtroom was filled with, guess who? Other teachers, parents, and folks from the school, right? And eventually, we saw it first, the judge had to dismiss two of the teachers because they were making faces at the 12-year-old while he was on the stand. We watched it happen. We're just, and it was our heads going back and forth because we knew we couldn't shout out in the courtroom, but we were trying to go, do you see what this person is, two junior high other teachers were making faces at a 12-year-old as he testified. So, who else got groomed? The whole community, right? Parents, teachers, other staff at the school were there for this upstanding person that they just couldn't believe. Why? Because we have a difficult time believing that somehow we don't have some sort of meter that's gonna go off. I would know, right? We don't. It's everyday folks. And it's important for us to recognize that no matter how wonderful or community oriented or religious or high paying, high achieving that person may be, if they are also choosing to violate and perpetrate sexual violence, they also do that, right? And those other things don't cancel it out. So it's important, again, to think about how the victim's identity may be part of the weapon, right? If I choose, right, the teen who at the school who's already being bullied or who is, gender nonconforming or is already experiencing a lot of, high truancy, obviously something's going on at home, are they going to believe that kid instead of me, right, as the adult, the upstanding adult? We know that those power differentials play a major role, even when they're slight power differentials, right? Just status in the family can make a difference, right? So those messages then that, did you have, Mary?
Well, then we have a TV well-known celebrity who ruins a whole nation.
Yes. Absolutely, right? Talk about who else gets groomed? The whole nation. Yes, yeah, right? If that person is everybody's dad, right, then that's a really hard thing to stomach that's true.
Yeah. Why are all these survivors coming out now?
Yes.
All of a sudden, even though they all have the same story.
Yes, right?
They must be working together.
Yeah, yeah. And, right, questioning delayed reporting, when delayed reporting is completely natural, right? We know that it's much more rare for someone to make an immediate report. Much more rare. It usually takes weeks, months, years, and especially in terms of child sexual abuse, the average is that it's years later that it's reported.
In the foster care system even, children are not saying anything until they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yes. Yeah. We were. I was just a couple days ago meeting with a victim witness advocate, and we were saying, some of the folks that really desperately need the victims of crime compensation in order to get therapy are child sexual abuse survivors. Well, the age cutoff is 28, and you're exactly right. It's 30s, 40s, 50s. I have a client right now. She's about to have her 78th birthday, and she has just in these last few years been working on child sexual abuse because she was ready, because she had some support in her life at this point to say, I want to do this. Yeah. But there's no way, right, no matter her financial situation, that there's still, as the system is set up right now, the resource for, saying you deserve to get help and healing because what was done to you was a crime,
right.
Yeah.
Shame on those people.
So what we know is that the messages of the abuse itself, or maybe overtly from the abuser, are spoken and unspoken, right? They're subtle ways that gives a message, remember, of the worth of the individual, speaks to their sort of self-identity, and definitely they become internalized. And I think that's where I find a lot of the very powerful work that I am very honored to do with survivors every day is looking at how those messages start from someone else's behavior, from someone else's view of them, and then become part of their narrative, part of their ideas of who they are. And a favorite quote that I have is from Audre Lorde. People know who Audre Lorde? A few in the room, yes. Just a phenomenal Black lesbian feminist and activist. And in one of her writings that always struck me, it said, whenever those old recordings start to play in your mind, right? So you're not good enough, or this is, you're not worthy, or anything negative that starts to play in your mind, take a moment and close your eyes and try to put a face or a voice to that ugly message. And what you will always find, it is not your face and it is not your voice. And I think that speaks very powerfully to how messages of the abuse, the manipulation, the deception, the ways that vulnerability and targeting are used to create self-blame in survivors of child sexual abuse, that it becomes internalized. And so then later, as someone walks in the world, that old recording plays and it sounds like, well, that's just my own voice, right? That's now what that person believes about themselves, possibly. So we start from that place, and we may think, well, I need to get to that. You're thinking these, distorted thoughts about yourself, but where did that come from, right? It makes sense. It's part of the fabric. It's part of their narrative in terms of what they experienced. And so if we can get back to who does that really belong to, that lie about you that someone used in order to create access or vulnerability, or that they used to betray or to groom or to create a situation or opportunity for abuse. Please.
The thing I find interesting about the brain is when a person thinks of that violence acted upon them, the brain doesn't realize that the violence isn't happening anymore.
Right now.
The brain thinks it's happening right now. So every time they tell the story, think of the story, have any emotion with the story, they're reliving that crime and that situation over and over. And it's very interesting, I think, that the brain doesn't know the difference.
Absolutely. Trauma memories are not kept in a part of the brain that have a time and a date stamp, right? So when they come up, that was, June of 1986. No, that it's right now, right? And those sensory memories and the way that alarm system sets off in the brain for that individual is perceiving it. Absolutely. So thank you, for sharing that. I think the kind of piece that goes with that then what are those survival skills, right? How does someone create survival in a situation where when that comes up, it's very distressing, disturbing, and can create a lot of havoc in day-to-day life. And really, on the long term, impact, right, that survivor's worldview. Is the world a safe space? Is it a place where I'm going to get my needs met? And I know for me, in working with many folks who are, teens or adults, by the time they are unpacking that child sexual abuse, those pieces are very pivotal in recognizing that, along with absolutely understanding, right, the trauma that's there. Oftentimes we see when there's domestic violence, and I think with so many of us that cross over into child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, addictions counseling, all of these pieces that we know are so connected to abuse in families and communities. Some of the messages, right, if we think about what those messages are, connected to situations where children are both exposed to DV and there may be child sexual abuse in the household. We know that there is a very strong correlation between folks perpetrating, in terms of abusing partners and abusing kids that are in that household. Some of the best work that I'm seeing is coming out of Canada on that, where they're doing joint offender programs to look at who are the offenders that are both batterers and child sexual abuse or sexually assaulting adults and children. And what we see, the messages that kids get in those situations is violence is the answer, right? It is really okay, or in fact, better to be the person with power over others. That's the only way to get your needs met, right? It's the only way to get what I want or get, what's good in my life has to come from having power over someone else. That violence or that sort of manipulation is love. That's how someone shows, right? Possession, getting really angry, all of those sorts of things, that means that person loves me. And that relationships are just inherently unequal, right? And of course, going out into society and everything's based on a hierarchy, that's just reinforced even more, right? If I see that, caring or, love or family relationships are totally unequal, there are these big power differentials, then I go out into school, there's big power differentials, and I go out into the workplace, there's big power differentials, and a lot of those are exploitive, right? They're not just benign hierarchies everywhere. That reinforces many of those same situations. And, sometimes the sense of like, well, some people deserve to be hurt. They bring it on themselves, right? It's okay. And don't we do this with other forms of oppression, right? Like, well, I really definitely think that, it's really bad, don't say a racist joke, but you know how it is, those folks, they really bring it on themselves. right? That we do this sort of divide and conquer in a way that makes something that maybe affects us not okay, but for another group, it's, well, maybe that's all right. And I think that same sort of thing happens in terms of being in abusive situations for kids. It can reinforce a lot of very rigid gender roles and stereotypes. And I think something to be very careful about. I know in the Laura's situation, we saw how she had been exposed, right, to domestic violence and emotional abuse or things like that, seeing mom and dad. But one of the things that doesn't bear out in the research is that it's not true that someone who's abused or exposed as a child then later on is going to, quote, pick a batterer or pick an abuser, right? So I think we have to get away from that idea like someone's picker is broken, and really, because I hear that a lot in lots of different shapes or forms, like, oh, well, they couldn't help it, they didn't know any better, they went and picked that person. Because how are abusers at first? Charming, right? They look, when people said, what's positive grooming? Complimenting you, taking you to do fun things, being your support person, spending time with you. That sounds like a good person, right? That would be, I'd want my friend or my partner to do those things for me. Good folks and folks who are abusive look the same often at first, right? It is after, right, there's a level of trust or kind of what a lot of us call like sort of the hook is in. We've said, I love you, or, somebody is, there's maybe a first sort of sexual experience or an exchange that creates some level of vulnerability, and then the abuse starts, right? So we want to be very careful about that, and also about messages of like assertiveness. Well, if someone was just assertive and they set their boundaries and they're clear about that, this won't happen. And we can do a lot of risk reduction education with kids, even with very little ones, around boundaries and their bodies, and allowing kids to have safe spaces to talk about it and know they'll never be in trouble if you come and tell me that something felt creepy or uncomfortable or something hurt your body, or even if something made you curious about your body or something felt good and you want to talk about it. Let's talk about that, right? It leaves that door open. Did I see your hand?
Yeah, I think that I have a lot of women that I see who've been abused, and there's the notion, like you said, that they're out looking for somebody to abuse them. And I say, no woman looks for somebody to abuse them. My dad did it to my mom, and that's so attractive, and that's the kind of partner I want. Nobody does that. But like you say, they're charming in the beginning, and then they're groomed, and it's gradual, and then it's like there's some level of, oh, well, I know how to do this.
Yes.
It's comfortable, it's familiar, and they've seen their mother put up with it, and they know how to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that's where something being familiar and even having the survival skills to get through it. Absolutely. And so again, it's about making sense of that rather than saying, well, that's, as I did with Laura, making that a big question of like, well, why are you so weak about this, right? But this is something that you're trying to protect yourself as best you can, yeah, and you're getting by because of your survival skills.
So then they're groomed to this learned behavior, which would also mean learned helplessness? Or is that separate?
I'm not a fan of, of that concept.
I don't like that concept.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering.
But I think we can talk about why it makes sense for there to be a normalized view of, well, just like these ones, power differentials in a relationship are given, right? In fact, it might mean you really love me if you want to protect, you're jealous of other people, you want all my time, you say you and I against the world, right? That may even be a gendered sort of role thing, and so those things get normalized, not because someone is actually helpless, because I think often the people that are dealing with that have, as Mary said, such tremendous survival skills, and they are being self-protective in the ways they know how. And I think that's what we have to point out are the positive aspects of how do we use that, and if or when that person wants to potentially move out of that sort of relationship, then we're willing and able to talk about how many positive strengths they have to do so. Yeah, yeah. So Also thinking about, right, the places where we can, I think, take a wrong turn is using judgment, and really, I'm not doing a trauma-informed presentation, although it kind of always is, but the pieces around trauma, recognizing that it's much better to be curious about what we're seeing. Why would, someone be connected to, like, we may see a child who is in that household where they're experiencing or exposed to domestic violence and they're being sexually assaulted, and they're very much wanting to stay connected to that household, right? That they are, horribly upset or even recanting around, any of the reports that have been made. We know that all of that is very normal behavior in terms of how the losses of that family, of the familiar structure, all of those pieces are probably going to keep someone silent, and their needs for that are very much natural, right? We don't want to say, oh, that's obviously destructive, or they're not taking care of themselves. What we know is that often there's a weighty challenge there to understand how that is operating and how much that safety and familiarity is important to that child. Also, just thinking about the fact that if you convey to a child who's in one of those situations that, hey, your mom should be doing this or that, or that they're somehow to blame, or there's a lot of judgment around what's going on, what if they're needing to tell you, when we know that DV and, child sexual abuse are linked, and you're blaming, right, the parent that is potentially being abused, what might you think if they disclose, right? So what I see a lot of times is the child abuse being shut down because the children are already hearing how other adults think of their parent who's being abused. And that makes it a no-go. I'm not gonna tell about what's happening to me because they already think it's her fault, right? And that judgment can be very silencing. Definitely, we know there are some of the social learning theories. DV research and social learning and sexual assault research and social learning are absolutely two different animals. So very important for us to recognize, unlike some of the things that we know about boys that grow up in homes where there's DV, that there's a higher percentage of batterers who have seen that. We don't see that same thing bearing out with folks who commit sexual offenses having long histories of sexual violence in their past. So very different. But we definitely want to check in, especially with girls in homes where there's domestic violence, because they are 8 times as likely to be sexually abused. What do we think is the dynamic there? And we're talking about, so this is a heterosexual couple where it's mom and either boyfriend, father, stepfather, and mom's being battered. Girls in that home are 8 times as likely to be sexually abused. What's going on?
I think overall, like, the partner is terrorizing the home, and one weapon he's using is sexual abuse.
Absolutely, right? Terror of the whole home, and one of those weapons, right, is violence as well, sexual abuse against the child, yeah. Often what we're seeing in those situations too is a sense of everyone in this home is equally an object to me, right? And especially girls and women in this home are an object to me. And so when you think about status or power differentials, right, sexism is going to play a role in some of those types of situations. Yes?
I think too, sometimes the daughter becomes a caretaker in the household and sort of takes over sometimes that role of caretaker, and therefore becomes seen as another partner.
Is then totally inappropriately sexualized as, like, now I'm sort of taking you on as my partner, right, in that sexual abuse. Yes, yeah. So we want to check for that. The other thing that I think is so important to talk about is, for child sexual abuse survivors, the fact that most of the time kids are going to tell in some way. Not in the way that we were asking Laura to, right? To throw off all those sheets and come forward, and even though it's very scary and there are very real potential losses, tell someone what's happened when you're that little 7-year-old, right? So what we see is that often kids will act out and have what we call sexually reactive behaviors, where they will inappropriately display the knowledge that they have now from the sexual abuse, right? So they're inappropriately, touched or abused by whether another kid or an older family member or a stranger or that teacher or even a parent. And if there's not adequate supervision, or if there are a lot of opportunities to be alone with other kids, if they're made to babysit very early with other kids, then they will oftentimes act on those new sexual bits of knowledge, right? What kid doesn't have natural curiosity about body parts, about who has what, right? Who didn't have a Barbie and rip all the clothes off first thing? Because that is a natural sense of curiosity. And when we look at that scale of how that happens for kids, oftentimes what we're seeing are multiple layers of trauma for children who have been sexually abused and then are experiencing a home where there's not enough supervision, or where mom and dad are, taken by, their own addiction or by work or by whatever else is happening, so that they're not paying attention to that sexual reactivity. Now what we have is a whole household of kids who have been inappropriately, sexually touched and abused, and that is a really devastating consequence of oftentimes one perpetrator, right, perpetrating on someone in a household and that spreading throughout. One of the things to recognize is there's two pieces, right? It's very different for a child to be sexually reactive than for that child to be a perpetrator. And the work of Tony Kavanaugh Johnson is really pivotal, I think, in clarifying the differences. Oftentimes sexually reactive kids, they have inappropriate sexual knowledge, things like recognizing what, trying to, penetrate, or mutual masturbation or things like that. When you're getting to those levels, you're really seeing a child who has knowledge that is outside of what they would regularly have curiosity about and have usually been exposed, whether that's to pornography or to, other forms of physical child sexual abuse. And then we can look at that scale and really look towards what are the bits of sexual knowledge children should have, where are the things that are like, where are they getting that from? And then when are there things that are like, that is not information, right, that a little one at their developmental level should have. And I think it's important too for us to be able to talk about sexual reactivity, with our clients. And I know just recently starting the healing process, therapeutic process with 2 new clients that are both male clients, and having them have a hard time talking about the sexual abuse, but having an even harder time talking about sexual reactivity with siblings, cousins, nieces that continued in the family. Why? Because the rest of the family was caught up with other stuff going on and really weren't watching what was happening. There was so much inappropriate sexual play between these kids. So when we think about that, we want to imagine how much we could intervene in terms of recognizing those appropriate bits of knowledge, sexual knowledge that kids have, and when those are out of bounds. And also developing a way to talk about how sexual reactivity is actually a way that kids are telling, right? Because people have a lot of shame. I didn't come forward, it kept happening, and then I was acting out with other kids, and does that mean I'm a perpetrator? I think that's the first question. It's devastating, but it's one of the first questions that most male survivors ask me, just because there's stigma around that, and the myth that, if it happens to a boy, he's gonna go and do it to someone else. Not true. But they may have been sexually reactive. So then that creates all of this guilt around, well, is that what I was doing? What was happening? Most of the time, kids are telling, right? They tell through play, they tell through showing. And what we have to do is make sure if a child has been abused, that we're protecting and making sure that the play with other kids is appropriate, and that child has a place to develop and heal from their trauma, so that they're not having to show and tell in those ways. We can juxtapose that then with just a brief moment of what we know around perpetration. And I think some of the main questions that come up that I just want to debunk a little bit for each is, I know when and I think it was the congressman that was sexually abusive, sending all sorts of inappropriate emails to these teen pages. And what he said when it came out into the media was, I've just been diagnosed with depression, I'm an alcoholic and I'm starting to go to AA, I actually think I'm gay, and I was sexually abused as a child myself, right? So he just, I was like, thank you for doing my presentation for me, because for using all of the excuses that oftentimes are used. And really the reason why I call them excuses and justifications is because what we know is that using terminology like, well, if someone would rape a baby, they must be crazy. That's got to be a sick person, right? Only serves to, in a very ableist way, stigmatize folks who do have psychiatric or mental health diagnoses, because bipolar, schizophrenia, none of these diagnoses cause someone to sexually abuse children, right? We hear this a lot in the, where we have the cases of female teachers and male students, sexual abuse cases, not sexual affairs, not illicit, rendezvous with a student, but where adult women are sexually abusing their male students that are minors, that they have bipolar. Nothing in the diagnosis of bipolar says, and then you sexually abuse children, right? So we have to be very careful. That only serves to stigmatize. And what we're doing, understandably, as a society is we want to distance ourselves, like, oh, that can't be the everyday people that we know that do these things. But I think it's important, too, that we help survivors in their healing process to understand that most of the time what we're seeing is it's very much a choice. If it were a compulsion, something someone absolutely could not stop, they would do it bring kids out into the middle of McDonald's and start to sexually abuse them in front of everyone, right? They wouldn't wait in the stall at McDonald's and threaten a kid and, continue to groom or perpetrate over time. They wouldn't lock the door or tell you that your family's going to be broken up, or, right? That is opportunistic, well-developed grooming that is not about compulsion or mental illness. So it's so important that we start to recognize that reality. Yeah.
Last night I was watching Tune In Between a commercial, the 2020 special, tomorrow. It's going to be on a middle school teacher who I guess they've been together with her male student for 10 years.
Mary Kay Letourneau.
So that's what the topic is tomorrow. I thought it was interesting, kind of what you're talking about.
Absolutely, yes. And one of the clients that I work with, her perpetrator's hero is Mary Kay Letourneau. And yeah, so that if I'm thinking about the one who she ended up marrying and having 2 children with her victim, yeah. So, what we know in terms of drug use and addiction is that there are plenty of people in recovery who have never in their addiction, violated other folks. And all of us could become intoxicated, high, whatever it is right now, and we're not going to go home and molest our kids or beat our partner. So what we know is folks use drugs and alcohol as an excuse or to disinhibit themselves, and often it means that the assaultiveness lasts longer and that there's more injuries to the victim, but it doesn't cause it. And I think that, again, stigmatizes folks who may be struggling with addiction. Sexual orientation, what we know is oftentimes when we talk about this, what we're saying is blaming folks that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning. And I think we see this coming out in a lot of the clergy abuse scandals and things like that. And I think it's important to recognize 96+% of folks who perpetrate or who are offenders identify as heterosexual. Not only that, at the time when they're molesting kids of any gender, they're usually having consensual adult relationships, sexual relationships. So it's not about someone who can't get sex somewhere else. We really are seeing that this is a choice, right, to take power and control away. And oftentimes those who will perpetrate against children, if they don't have an opportunity, they'll switch and potentially perpetrate against an adult. And those are some of the things that sometimes don't come out. It's easier in a society, though, to target already targeted populations than to kind of speak the truth about some of the scary facts that it could really be anyone. And then finally, from CSOM, with the Center for Sex Offender Management and the Association for Treatment of Sexual Abusers, what we know is that 75 to about 99% of perpetrators, when they are caught and they have to go into a treatment program, or they're going in to be hospitalized or going into jail, they'll be given a psychosocial history, and 75 to 99%, depending on what research you read, will say, I didn't know any better, I did it because it happened to me. And so what they wanted to see was, like, how truthful is that, right? Why are we hearing that so often, more often than not? So they said to folks, well, now we're going to give you a polygraph. Is there anything on your questionnaire about your life, your history, any of that you'd like to change, right? So they're not hooked up yet. They're just saying, later, we're going to give a polygraph. Anything you want to change before we do the polygraph, the lie detector test? Any idea from that 75 to 99% saying, absolutely, I was sexually abused, didn't know any better, what that number goes down to? You're close, 13%. The overwhelming majority of folks who perpetrate child sexual abuse, sexual violence, are not survivors of sexual violence themselves, right? So there's, again, and this is why we juxtapose sexual reactivity with perpetration. They're very different things. You have a small portion of folks who may have experienced it themselves, and when you see teen perpetrators, folks who are potentially in 13, 14 years old, you may see folks who have had experiences of sexual abuse in their past, and because they have never had any help for that, or they're not being able to get what they need, that they start to get to a place where then they're impacting more and more people in that process. Okay, so what are the consequences then? What we see is by teen years that folks are, survivors are much more likely to engage in substance use or abuse, to have multiple partners, to potentially have sex before the age of 15, 4 to 6 times more likely to become pregnant, and 8 to 9 times more likely to have attempted suicide. And for LGBTIQ population, that is astronomically high, because it's already about 6 to 10 times the rate, and then you add to that if there's experiences of child sexual abuse and targeting. Those are some of the things that we see coming out of that. Also looking at those phases, that in the healing process we really want to pay attention to. What are the layers of trauma that came from grooming, right? What are the layers of trauma that came from how the sexual interaction, the abuse or the assault took place, right? Some of those, as the person is ready, some of those details will be important. What are some of the layers of trauma that came from the secrecy, the silence, the ways that they felt they wouldn't be credible, or the ways that self-blame or shame kept them quiet, or the ways that first disclosures became so traumatizing that they stopped, right? So where is that secrecy impactful? And then finally, disclosure, often to self first, often to, can I accept or even believe that that's what happened, and then mobilizing to figure out how that works in a healing process. Definitely, as we said, in an ecological system, the relationship of that perpetrator is going to have a major impact on the dynamics and the healing process. The who, what, where, how it happened, right? That context is going to be pivotal. And what we know is that identity has a big role to play in disclosure, and in looking at how there are different ways that people may come forward, and we want to find as many spaces and as many comfortable, safe spaces for people to tell and to disclose. Most of the time, child sexual abuse survivors are first looking to practice disclosure, meaning someone to listen, to not have judgment, to believe what's happened, prior to, I want to report, right? I want something to be done. And I have a slide further on. I want to stop so we can make sure for questions. But thinking about that identity and disclosure, oftentimes it goes undisclosed and definitely unreported for a lot of populations, right? So for children, first and foremost, there's going to be, if at any disclosure, delayed disclosure, that's natural. And we want to absolutely empathize with the fact that it's understandable that that would be delayed, right? We know in terms of folks, women of color, for male survivors, for LGBTIQ survivors, for survivors with disabilities, we could go through this whole list and imagine that some of the ways that these groups are viewed in society are going to be an additional barrier. That's going to be another sheet or 2 or 20 that will say, don't tell, people aren't going to believe it, or you're going to have to be in jeopardy of loss, of relationships, of your status in the community, whatever that may be, if you come forward, right? And we have to think about the fact, again, it doesn't happen in that vacuum, and that people, I'm going to go forward just a little bit, right, may be afraid of a lot of different things, right? Well, what about if I tell and someone gets in trouble, and I'm in a community of color? Well, there's lots of racism in the criminal justice system. How do I deal with that fact, right? What does that mean for me coming forward? Is there going to be a backlash about that? So you'll see, and I gave you more slides than we could go through, but just thinking about how we bring these things to the healing work that we do with others, folks' faith traditions, and the kinds of stereotypes that are out there. Definitely we know that oppression plays a role, and all of the tactics that we see, this is from the power and control wheel, but what folks in other social justice movements have done is they've said all of these same tactics are often present in terms of how someone identifies, right? If they've been targeted, if they've felt marginalized in some way. Think of, a child who is, a deaf survivor. Are they going to be able to find an advocacy group, that signs, right? Are they going to have to tell multiple people, or is that going to get back to deaf community? Is that going to be a safe space? And so all of those pieces may be in the mix in addition to the sexual abuse itself, right? So thinking about how that adds. What oftentimes people are looking to do is to steer clear of these losses, right? Am I going to lose my relationships, my support, my family, my familiar surroundings? What's going to happen? Just like we heard for Laura, that very real fear of, will my family be broken up? Will I lose the people that I love? And so recognizing that with that legacy of the sexual abuse comes as well trauma and oppression. And I know, just in our short time today, I didn't go a lot into the trauma response, but I hope to give us a more global or sort of ecosystem view of how that trauma presents itself, how we as a community and as individual practitioners might be able to meet individuals and families where they are in their process of healing. And I hope that some of these things are useful. Definitely, if you're interested in more training or more information, in June, myself and a colleague, Mahima Mohan, will be doing a presentation specifically on trauma-informed responses with survivors of sexual violence. So there are some flyers over on the table. It's a day-long presentation. So if you'd like to work more together on sharing our skills around that healing process, please be in touch with us. Any questions? I know we're at the end of time, but I'm happy to take questions that haven't been asked during. Yes?
This is a I think one of the big consequences of sexual assault can be intellectual impairment.
Yes.
Because a lot of women will come in and think that they are stupid, that they have not achieved what they need to achieve, they haven't done well in school, they didn't do well in high school. And I asked them, what was going on in your life like when you were in 3rd grade?
Yes.
And because that's when, in 3rd grade, that's when you're learning your reading skills, your math skills, all of that. And many of them will say that they were traumatized in some way. And the trauma, the assault doesn't have to happen all the time. You just never know. It could be tonight. So that kid is worried about what's going to happen tonight and can't focus on schoolwork. So I think that is such a huge thing to be sure to bring in with people.
Yes. And Mary, exactly what you're talking about. I put, this very old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What we know is we've got to have those bottom part of the pyramid before we can take care of anything at that top, right? So when we think about the physiologically safe, right, and Someone over here talked about the trauma response going off. Mary, you're talking about how are you going to go and attend to your spelling test and your multiplication tables if you can't stop the intrusive thoughts of what's going to happen tonight, how am I going to be safe, who's going to be there when I get home. That is not an atmosphere where you can attend to those things, not by choice, but because that frontal lobe is literally saying, we're not doing math problems now, right? The brain is saying, stay safe, you're in danger, what are you going to do? So if we don't attend to those physiological, those safety needs, belongingness and love needs, right? If someone doesn't feel as though I'm going to be accepted for who I am when I come forward because I'm transgender, what does that mean for that person's potential to heal, to get to those place of, I need to know, I need to understand what I've been through, how do I heal from this? That's not even going to be on the map until there can be, I have a place, I feel like I belong, I can be heard. So absolutely, it's going to have a major impact. And I would say the vast majority, probably 60% of folks that I work with, at some point during their childhood, were labeled as having a learning disability, were held back, were, called many names in terms of their intellectual abilities. Yeah, thank you. So I know we're at time. I really thank you all. Please feel free to be in touch. You have my contact information, and please pick up more about Bridges to Healing training if you'd like more info. Thank you.